Hi. So obviously, a little while ago, Governor Abbott has made an announcement about opening up the state uh, businesses to 100% and dropping the state mandates on masks, which is not to say you can't continue to wear a mask. You can continue to wear a mask. And I think we've done a really good job of staying apolitical when it comes to displaying this kind of information and try to assess what it might look like if. And so I'm going to go to obviously the stuff that you guys know that I like, the COVID-19 Health Data Organization. These forecasts are very nice. They're very well put together. The math on them is relatively solid. And they have been from the beginning. They've only gotten better over time as we learned more about COVID-19 and forecasting out what COVID-19 might look like. And so I want to take a look real quick at two graphs and what they might look like. The first one is this guy, the daily infections and testing. So what we might think daily infections might look like, and we'll talk about that in a second. And the second one I want to pull is daily deaths. And this is today as of March 2nd, what these forecasts might look like. But let's take a look at one of them at a time here. Maybe I can draw a little bit on them. But first and foremost, you have on the right-hand side over here, like this is kind of today and what things might look like. We have to forecast kind of in the past a little bit here, which is a weird. Texas is taking 2 weeks before they confirm all COVID-related deaths. And so we're kind of, it's an interesting deal for us because we're kind of forecasting into the past, which is weird. That's just the way it is. This top line is an estimation of not the worst case scenario, but say on a 95% confidence interval, this is basically no masks, right? This is what the government or the Texas government is looking at as an accepted number. And this is if they would turn around and go back to 100% masks. And so we have this estimation of what might happen as if we were currently walking down this purple line where there is a percentage of the population that don't wear masks and etc. What's interesting here is if we were to pick one single date and go vertically on the chart, say April 21st, just because it's listed, there's a difference here of about 10,000 infections per day. 10,000 infections per day. That might probably happen as opposed to what we think is happening, which is a worst case scenario if you consider the best to the worst. More realistically, we're really talking about from here to here, because this is kind of where we're projected. So it's more like a 5,000 additional infections per day that will probably occur. So before, I'm not saying it's the right decision, I'm not saying it's the wrong decision from a political standpoint, but before we all get carried away, note that we're talking about an additional 5,000 infections per day. And then if you look forward, if you kind of look forward in time here, this 5,000 spreads out and it turns into what's 5,000 here is going to turn into 10,000 by the middle of May. And obviously the curvature of the worst case scenario prolongs how long we stay in this COVID-19 thought process well into June and July, as opposed to being able to travel as early as May or whatever. But maybe more importantly, certainly more emotionally, is what would happen to the total number of deaths if, right? And so same thing here on the right hand, the top line, you have the worst case scenario, which we're calling the no masks scenario, right? And on the very bottom line, you have the 100% mask scenario. And here, there's a couple of really, really interesting things. And the first one is that this spread between one and the other looks more like about 60 people. That's 60 people per day that will probably die of COVID-19 as early as 1 May. As well, actually, if you go back a little bit, you can see the spread, and by spread, I mean the variants occurring somewhere at the end of April. So we're a month away from this thing, diverging in terms of our forecasted numbers. And then, it kind of stays about the same throughout. And that tells us a couple of different things. Number one, obviously, that number is bigger. Number two, The actual spread from our projected from here to here is probably closer to 30 people per day. Okay, 30 people per day. And that one does, if you can see forward, it actually spreads out. This looks more like 50 people per day that otherwise wouldn't have died, as opposed to 30. So that one does kind of spread a little bigger as we walk into time and it moves forward. So that's not necessarily great. Yeah, that's not necessarily great. The other thing that's interesting about these numbers is, you know, we're looking at here on any one of these given dates here, you're looking at 100. You know, this is the 100 line, right? There's 100 people here on that date. But we were talking in the previous graph on that same date at having up to close to 20,000 infections, right? So 100 deaths over 20,000 infections gives you a 1 in 20? No, 1 in 200. 1 in 200. So our estimated death rate or rate of death is now 0.005 or 0.5%. And that is 3 times smaller than it was a year ago, right? So we can stop and say that there is compared to last year, remember the video on anchor points, a much, much higher rate of survivability. And whether that's because those people who otherwise would die already have died, or because our medical expertise has grown in this area, or because of the rate of vaccines and etc. That's a big deal. And it's a victory no matter which way you slice it. So we're doing better, I think, at managing those deaths, and that's where maybe some of this logic comes from. But there's still somewhere between 30 and 60 people per day who otherwise would not, well, no, I shouldn't say 60. We should really say 30. Somewhere between 30 people per day and growing after May, right? About a month from now, 2 months from now, that otherwise probably wouldn't pass. And that's kind of where these measurements should be taking place. Now, again, it is not our place. It's not my place as a mathematician to turn around and say we should do this or we shouldn't do this. I have a personal political opinion. It's 5,000. And if you want to hear it, you can buy me a cup of coffee and come over to the office. But I'm not going to espouse my political opinions here, just the mathematical ones. I think we're in a much, much better scenario than we ever were. I think we can handle the medical issues better than we can. These curves already have the vaccine curvatures taken into account, by the way. And that's just a small example of what Austin might be thinking. Whether you think it's appropriate or not, that's where the mathematical logic probably comes from.